By the late 1970s, roughly 60% of the world's population found itself under socialist governments of one kind or another. Communists ruled China, Russia, Eastern Europe, and much of Asia. Third world socialist governments controlled 3 nations in the Middle East and Africa. Social democratic parties held majorities in much of Western Europe. Even with all its problems, socialism was still in power. Then, unexpectedly, the pendulum began to swing.
In 1968, the influential American sociologist Michael Harrington could convincingly write these words: "Most of the people around the world call the name of their dream socialism. Despite all the carnage wrought in its name, the idea of socialism somehow retained great power over the human imagination." But even then, socialism's grip on power was coming to an end. Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. Welcome to the concluding episode of Heaven on Earth, a think tank special. In this hour, the 2 great communist powers move away from socialism with momentous consequences. In the West, in order to stay in business, democratic socialists relabel themselves the party of business. And among the kibbutzim of Israel, the socialist faithful are tested by modernity, prosperity, and generational change. We begin in China.
如果现在再不实行改革，我们的现代化事业和社会。
In December 1978, the Chinese Communist Party yielded to vision of a new leader, Deng Xiaoping. Deng's plan for China after Mao began with what he called the 4 modernizations of agriculture, industry, technology, and defense.
What was different about Deng Xiaoping is that he was not ideological. He didn't believe you could introduce utopia overnight, as Mao thought he could do. And he realized that in order to bring about change in China, you had to have fundamental economic reforms.
Change lay ahead for the social democratic world as well. The following spring, Margaret Thatcher became the first female Prime Minister of Britain. Central to a campaign, a promise to reverse the legacy of Clement Attlee. She began by privatizing many of the nationalized industries.
Margaret Thatcher's election in 1979 really is an emblem of the first triumphs of the capitalist revolution. A year later, Ronald Reagan comes to office. Soon after that, socialist regimes in France and Spain make definite rightward turns. So while it would be too much to see Margaret Thatcher's election as the beginning of the end, it is a very powerful first salvo and an augur of things to come.
What I'm describing now is a plan and a hope for the long term. The march of freedom and democracy, which will leave Marxism, Leninism on the ash heap of history as it has left other tyrannies which stifle the freedom and muzzle the self-expression of the people.
The accession to power of Ronald Reagan, which happened to come at around the same time as the shift to the right in other comparable societies, all of them had in common, not just Reagan but also Thatcher, the view that Soviet power, the apparently unshakable edifice of the USSR and its Eastern European dependencies, needn't be taken for granted, that its survival was not a given. Why assume that they're going to be our rivals forever? Why not see if we can outbid them and even subvert them?
As Reagan took office, signs of strain were beginning to appear in the Soviet Empire. In the summer of 1980, Polish workers defied the communist government by going on strike in the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk. The strike grew into an independent trade union committed to democracy, Solidarity. Soon it could count more than 1 out of every 4 Poles as members.
The advent of Solidarity in Poland was one of the most significant factors that contributed to the collapse of communism. First, by example, the fact that Solidarity, an independent trade union, could come into existence in a workers' state where workers were allegedly happy showed, first of all, that they weren't happy, and second of all, that change was possible, and it was without question a great inspiration to the dissident movements across the bloc.
Meanwhile, the Kremlin faced a crisis in leadership. In March of 1985, Soviet leaders gathered in Red Square for the funeral of Konstantin Chernenko, the 3rd Soviet leader to die in office in the past 2 years. Their choice for a new leader was fateful. Mikhail Gorbachev may have been the last true believer in the revolution's ideals. But his attempt to recover true socialism from the communist bureaucracy would shake the Soviet Union to its foundations. Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev grew up in the 1930s. It was a period known as the Great Terror. Under the rule of Lenin's successor, Joseph Stalin, millions were arrested and often executed. Scholars say that as many as 20 million people died.
Gorbachev was the grandson of a rich peasant who was arrested, deported. These were called kulaks, and in the early 1930s, the kulaks were all told to go to work on collective farms, and those who disagreed were deported, killed, sent to concentration camps. His other grandfather was arrested in the 1930s, was also in a camp. So he grew up with a very powerful sense of what had been wrong with the system, of what had really happened during Stalin's time, and this probably did have an effect on his later politics.
By the time Gorbachev became General Secretary in 1985, he realized the Soviet system was not only cruel, it was hopelessly inefficient.
Imagine what it is getting an American driving license. It's quite difficult, quite a tedious process. Imagine doing it every day. This is what the Soviet life was. The whole system was based on people, as we said, pretending that they work, and the government pretending that it pays. It used more people where you could have used more brains, and that, I think, ineffectiveness, this swampish feeling of absolutely going nowhere, that was what Gorbachev inherited.
But for Gorbachev, the problem was not with the Soviet system itself. It was with how that system was being run.
One-party state socialism was, according to Gorbachev, a voluntary free choice of the Russian people. He felt that, therefore, he could loosen up the controls, but basically that would not change one thing that was the most important to him, which is the state ownership of the economy, which to him was the basis of the Soviet regime.
Gorbachev had a core diagnosis for what ailed the Soviet economy: bureaucracy. His prescription to fight it was called perestroika.
In a way, perestroika means rebuilding, transforming things. But I think that Gorbachev still considered it possible that all these things would be done within this centrally planned system that existed in the Soviet Union. That was his mistake.
Gorbachev set out to cut the red tape. But the whole system was made of red tape. For all his efforts, it seemed Gorbachev was running in place.
只有解放思想，坚持实事求是，一切从实际出发，
As Gorbachev struggled to clear a path to true socialism in the Soviet Union, the socialist idea was being redefined in China. Deng Xiaoping said his reforms were creating socialism with Chinese characteristics. Many observers thought it looked more like capitalism. Whatever it was changing the face of China. The country had just emerged from one of the most devastating periods in its history. After the failure of the Great Leap Forward, Mao Zedong launched the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. The goal was to cleanse the country of creeping capitalist and bourgeois influence. But Mao's new revolution soon veered out of control. Over the next decade, some 100 million Chinese citizens were persecuted, including Communist Party officials.
What Mao did was use the young people he called the Red Guards to literally throw out the party leaders, to rebel against their teachers, rebel against anyone with any position or any seniority. And so it was led to a period of utter chaos in China, in the economy, in the political system. And it was that chaos that totally, I believe, demoralized the population, turned them away not only from Mao, but from any belief that Marxism, Leninism, or any ideology, or any ideological utopia was going to solve their problems.
Deng Xiaoping had been with the communist movement from the beginning and served as one of Mao's closest advisors. But his pragmatic outlook had more than once landed him in trouble. During the Cultural Revolution, he was twice purged from power. Deng's family fared worse. The Red Guards drove his brother to suicide, and his oldest son to jump out of a window, sustaining injuries that left him a paraplegic. But Deng's fortunes would soon change. Mao's death in 1976 gave rise to a vicious power struggle, and Deng came out on top.
When Mao died, Deng was the highest ranking leader left. Several leaders died during the Cultural Revolution, and he came back to power with a few of his old communist buddies who supported him, who were totally disillusioned with Maoist policies, and they were open. They didn't know what they wanted to do. In fact, the slogan they used was, "We have to feel for the stones as we cross the river to get to the other side."